This Fleet Equipment Unscripted interview is presented by Hendrickson, a leading manufacturer of heavy-duty suspension systems and components to the global commercial transportation industry. Visit hendrickson-intl.com to learn more.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Morgan, editor of Fleet Equipment, and welcome to Fleet Equipment Unscripted. Today, we're talking with Matt Copot, Vice President of Maintenance, and Gino Fontana, Vice President of Operations, Berkeley Division, and Puerto Rico, both with Transervice. Gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to join me.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
All right, so we're hitting a topic that we've been talking a lot about, writing a lot about. We're catching up on the microchip shortage and how you're seeing it impact the fleet and customers that you work with out there in the industry. Let's just start with some basics here and recap for everybody, just in case they need a primer on what's going on. Can you give me an overview of what you're seeing from the microchip shortage, how it's impacting truck production and new production, and what you're hearing from OEMs and customers alike? Matt, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for allowing us to speak with you today. I mean, obviously, these are some key items impacting fleet owners respective to maintenance and operations right now. As we go back to the onset of this COVID-19 pandemic, it's basically when this chip shortage began. So the plants were reduced in a production sense from the OEMs to reduce their semiconductor chip orders, which subsequently led to semiconductor manufacturers have to shift their production to consumer electronics, as those orders were surging for the remote workforce, laptops, iPads, so on and so forth. So they were trying to keep their workforce moving, and then as this economy recovered, there was this, call it a thirst for equipment purchases that roared back, right? And had these OEs basically scrambling to source chips because their so-called production slots were now missing. To make matters much worse, you had two plant fires that took place at chip manufacturers that just simply exacerbated the chip shortage. And now you got a situation where your OEMs do not have any more build slots for the remainder of this year, and quite frankly, no openings moving into the first quarter of 2022. These guys are in a situation, the OEs, where they have cases where due to chips and you can include part shortages, that trucks in many cases are just really being tight to their production schedules. And in some cases, you might have units that are delivered to the dealers that require some additional installation prior to taking ownership of them. Meaning, they could be delivered with a couple of parts that require the dealer to actually sit on the equipment, wait for the part, and then install it prior to the owner taking ownership of the vehicle. So looks like they're planning to break out of this, by the third, fourth quarter this year, but it's still a very, very tight capacity situation for them.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think we're starting to see even more and more dominoes go. I know every week, especially even this week, I was having conversations with both suppliers and even service providers in terms of some of the products that they offer. And I was surprised that the chip shortage is hitting them as well. Like, this is when you really stop and think how many things have these microchips in them, it's more than you think. So it's going to be a continuing issue we're dealing with here, as you noted, going into the back half of 2021. Gino, what does that mean for hard equipment decisions, equipment availability, operational decisions, making sure you have the rolling equipment to get your loads where they need to go? What are you hearing from fleets you're talking about or talking with, and maybe what are you talking about coming down the line going into Q3 and 4 planning?
Sure. Yeah, those are the right questions to ask and the areas to focus on. This all comes when Class 8 truck orders are through the roof right now, up over 400% from last year. And so it's like the perfect storm, really. So when we get to the order cancellations or the extended lead times, orders being pushed to next year, like Matt said, fleets have to make some tough decisions about the equipment that they were planning on taking out of service. So what we've been encouraging our customers to do, and what we've been doing for them, are performing health checks to evaluate whether or not the equipment can run another year or 18 months or however long it's going to take to get a replacement in. Within that, you've got some potential balancing fleets can do. If you've got a fleet that's, say, coast to coast or multi-location, we may have one area that has some equipment that's ready to come out of service and they're okay without it. And you may have another area that's hot for equipment and they may be forced into a short-term solution, rentals or whatever. So you may be able to balance those out by moving the equipment. And it gets a little expensive when you're talking about moving equipment, depending on how far you're going. But it sure beats the alternative of not having a piece of equipment to do your runs. So between health checks, identifying the bad actors, those highest maintenance cost units, and the ones that just it doesn't make sense to keep them in service, or it's not safe or reliable. If you could find the good ones and try to prolong those, do the necessary repairs, you can buy some time that way. If you can move equipment between locations and try and balance things out, you can buy some time that way too. The other piece of this that is sort of coming into the picture now is it's forcing people to consider different makes. So if you've got a fleet that's historically been with 1 make, 2 makes, 3 makes, and all of those have come up dry for you or are already giving you the indication that there's going to be a problem with orders, it may force you to look at a different make. Now, the chip shortage and some of the other raw material shortages, they're agnostic. They're not focused on any one make or brand. They're affecting everybody. But that doesn't mean that the supplies on hand, dealer inventories, and those things are equal between the makes. So if you were with brand X all this time and they're just not going to be able to get you equipment and you need equipment, you may be forced to look at brand Y. And then that opens up, the obvious things that go along with that. So if you've got parts inventory for brand X and not brand Y, if you've got the relationship and the discounts on getting the equipment and getting the parts with brand X but not brand Y, those are going to be factors. And for those of us that are in the maintenance side of it, all of the requisite training, warranty coverages, toolage, all of the things that may be specific to a certain brand may not be present if you go to a different brand. So those are some tough decisions that people need to work through as they're trying to decide what makes the most sense. And then lastly, I'll throw this out there. We do see obviously a variety of how many miles a piece of equipment is going to run in a year. You've got equipment that runs low miles, you got equipment that runs high miles, right?
Right.
The equipment that runs high miles obviously is going to hit that threshold for replacement quicker than the low mileage vehicles. This may be a good time to look at utilization and for fleets to take a close, hard look at which pieces of equipment are assigned to those longer mile runs and which are assigned to the shorter mile runs, and start doing some balancing between those too. So if you've got equipment that's, say, due to be replaced at 700,000 miles, you're getting up around 600, and you know that you'll hit 700 within, say, the next 9 months.
Right.
Maybe time to take a look at putting that equipment on those shorter runs and moving up some of your shorter run equipment that's got a little bit more bandwidth on the high end of the spectrum. So those are some of the key pieces, but there has certainly been a lot of conversations along those lines driven by what's happening with the shortage of raw materials, namely microchips.
Right. No, for sure. And good points there. Good to know that there's options. They might not be the most fun options fleet manager has to look at, right? But definitely still options. Your note about playing the brands, right? Fleets know that game, but now is the time to really lean on those relationships. You got a long-standing relationship with one dealer, try to get in the build order. And if you aren't, then you are a new customer to another dealer, right? Which has its own
Exactly
benefits.
right.
So
Exactly
definitely totally okay to play those games. Business is business. But let's touch back on the maintenance part. The health check's definitely important. Matt, from the maintenance point of view, what's important for fleets to stay on top of if they start getting trucks that are a little long in the tooth, maybe more so than they're used to in terms of their typical PM schedules? What are your top tips for those to keep those trucks running and make the connections they need to make when production starts rolling?
Yeah, so another good question there, and something, after obviously the last 12 years and having a couple recessions there, many fleets unfortunately had to contend with this very scenario. And I think the first thing you go out and set yourself a budget, and it may seem overwhelming at first, but knowing what your baseline is, your target, will allow you to monitor your costs in a variety of, call it, buckets, which kind of help you within the following couple steps. The first thing, I would recommend is, follow a simple SWOT analysis. Basically identify what you're good at, your strengths, look at your weaknesses, identify the opportunities that exist and some of the threats, that exist within our sector. So for example, you could have a very good shop network, and a very good system to harvest and analyze the data of how your fleet's performing. And your weaknesses, quite frankly, could be that aging fleet, right? And the impending unscheduled work and potential breakdown frequency. Out of this, you can have opportunities that might be, hey, you might stretch your dollars allocated for purchases, through used truck purchases, or like Gino had mentioned, look at your equipment utilization. You may not need as many assets as you got on the paper right now. Your threats, those are emission regulations, perhaps costs associated with compliance, as well as technician shortages. Part of step 2 here is, look at the make it process, DMAIC. After you look through your SWOT analysis, which you've already completed, you've kind of already defined your objective, which in this case is addressing the increased fleet age, as well as trying to minimize the costs related to ongoing repairs, unscheduled repairs, hitting higher mileage bands. Your next piece of the puzzle, so to speak, as we move through that process, is your strength. Measure your process through your budget. What you're doing, make sure you're analyzing, your aging reports, identifying your equipment counts by model years, and kind of marrying up your costs as the unit's aging, which can kind of help you understand, what years and mileage bands you're starting to see an uptick in spend. You could do this through monthly reporting. You can look to kind of smooth out the edges by looking at it on a 12-month run rate, to identify trends within the year that you're seeing, to kind of further dial in on when those costs are starting to rise. You can isolate, again, the model years and mileage bands, and then, implement your VMRS repair codes, which can really dial you in onto the problematic failures, and then trying to remedy them by using call it a predictive style maintenance analysis.
Right.
And when we're looking at the analyze phase of things, we can kind of lump them in, say, for example, 4 main categories. You look at tires, which is obviously your highest spend item. What is the maintenance? What is the procurement, utilization? Do you know what your percentage of spend is attributed to tires? If not, you can utilize tools like ATRI to help you identify industry standards for costing. Review your tire program. Get with your tire rep, see if you can improve your performance and lower your costs through new purchases, recaps, along with maybe changing some of the repair criteria that you set forth. If you don't have a program, hey, this is a great place to start, and you can pretty much standardize your requirements at that point. Second category you could look at is, we touched on it earlier with emissions regulations, your after treatment costs. They'll be a big factor as you run more miles, and your likelihood of incurring these types of repairs will increase significantly. You can run into, anywhere between $12,000-$15,000 if a one box fails.
Right.
While this might not be likely in all the units, these types of repairs can certainly have a huge influence on the budget, in a negative manner. Another piece to look at, as you're analyzing, is look at your outside vendor network. In-house was literally a strength that we talked about during the SWOT analysis. You would anticipate lower costs as well as a better influence on the quality of work performed. look at that trade-off between the categories, as you're moving stuff in-house, that you are going to see a wage benefit increase. You're going to see your vehicle parts start to increase. But again, understand that it's monies you're moving from one bucket to another, and that outside vendor category should also mirror in a faster rate, lower costs on your outside side. If you are dealing with a vendor, there's no reason you can't establish service agreements, for their billing rates for service work. Give them instructions, what are the repair approvals? Is there a dollar threshold that they can't exceed without approval? So you have a chance to actually talk through that repair before it actually took place, and then you're trying to negotiate after the fact, which can be difficult. The last piece within that would be vehicle parts, your inventory management and procurement. Try to centralize a list of your aftermarket parts rather than OEs. Identify the ones that you're having problems with. Create a list of aftermarket products that you're buying that are reliable, and continuously update them, in a manner where it's a living document when, you can kind of sit there and say, I want my preferred vendors, and I have do not use vendors, right? And continue to monitor that. So you're pushing for the AV vendors to be used in most cases to leverage the savings and the reliability. In that manner too, from parts, you can negotiate pricing through the network, as whether you're a single source or whether you have multiple locations, at least you have peace of mind that you have competitive and consistent pricing. As we roll through the process, the improved process, it's basically generating those creative solution ideas. You cook that raw information and ideas, you've selected a solution, and then you go out to implement full scale. You could do that in a pilot sense, or you can roll it out full scale. Part of that improved process was what we talked through, as we identified those 4 categories. You identify them, but you're also trying to improve it, and how do we do it? And we kind of talked about those things together. And, the last part of that piece is your control process, which encompasses watching your process unfold and how much you're eventually going to yield out of it. It's vital that you control the process and consistently monitor it, or it's eventually going to fail. Some items to consider as you're controlling, you're bringing more work in-house because you're trying to provide for a better service and quality as the equipment ages. Look at shop productivity. How many PMs are we doing and how many respective repair hours? Monitor your schedule versus unscheduled. How many direct hours versus indirect hours are we having? Your work order counts, your labor payroll, for that amount that you might be pushing out to the vendor. Review their costs weekly or monthly. Those are the ways that I would recommend going through that whole process. And in closing, doesn't hurt to have a scorecard, to monitor your continued performance, and potentially work through other exercises with the same process, that could help you further improve your operations, And lastly, even though at this point you might not be purchasing equipment in the short term, don't lose sight of what your strategic purchase plan is, because we all know that once you start opening that back up, you should have some sort of plan on what you want to purchase once it starts to pick up again.
For sure, managing those budgets and P&Ls is a fleet manager's daily task. Something you'd mentioned that I know I talk a lot about, and it's definitely important, and it expands beyond the fleet manager to the whole service practice and department, and even the contract partners, of making sure the correct service data is captured at the time of service, right? Making sure you have that information in a clear, concise, uniform way, so that you can do these type of analysis, whether that's doubling down with your technicians and your shop managers saying, we got to get this information at the time of service. We have to know these details, right? Because if you don't have those, you can't match them up with your costs. And then from your service providers, making sure they're giving you something similar so that you can compare those apples to apples, because that's where it really happens. And fleet managers don't have a ton of control over that comes down to the technician and making sure they know it's important to capture that data. The shop manager, that it's important to double check that work when it comes in and make sure everything's good. I know it can seem tedious and it's a lot of repetition, but those are the important things that can make and break those P&Ls for sure. Gentlemen, it's been great catching up with you. The microchip shortage is something that we are going to be staying on for quite a while. I'm sure that we'll be talking maintenance a lot as well. So I'm sure I will talk to you again soon. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Take care.